There are moments when the universe holds its breath, when a single thoughtless sentence can rewrite the course of destiny and leave two hearts suspended between what was and what might be. For Lyra Voss, that moment arrived in the depths of the Alpha King's stronghold, where shadows held secrets and power lived in every stone. She had not wanted to be here, had certainly not volunteered to venture into the heart of Dawn Hollowcrest's domain, where even seasoned warriors spoke in whispers, and servants moved like ghosts afraid to disturb the air itself. But when the supply convoy needed someone small enough to navigate the fortress's ancient corridors, and brave enough to face whatever lay beyond its walls, Lyra's supervisor had pointed directly at her. "You're quick, you're quiet, and you don't ask stupid questions," Marcus had said, loading her pack with medical supplies destined for the Alpha King's personal chambers. "Get in, deliver the goods, get out. Don't touch anything, don't speak unless spoken to, and for the love of all that's sacred, don't stare." Simple instructions for what should have been a simple task. Walk through corridors carved from living rock, find the designated chamber, leave the supplies, and escape back to the relative safety of the outer territories where humans like her were tolerated rather than merely endured. But nothing about the Hollowcrest stronghold was simple. The fortress rose from the mountainside like something born of earth and storm, its towers reaching toward storm clouds that seemed permanently gathered overhead. Ancient magic had shaped these walls, carved passages that defied architectural logic, and created spaces that felt alive with watching presence. Every step echoed with the weight of history. Every shadow might hide eyes that tracked her movement with predatory interest. Lyra had made it through the outer corridors without incident, following the map Marcus had sketched with nervous precision, past the great hall where lesser wolves conducted pack business, through galleries lined with tapestries depicting centuries of conquest, up spiral staircases that seemed to climb forever into the mountain's heart. It was only when she reached the final door, massive oak bound with iron that looked forged by masters, that she hesitated, because beyond that threshold lay the Alpha King's private war chamber, where Dane Hollowcrest planned campaigns that shaped the fate of territories and made decisions that affected thousands of lives, where the most dangerous man in the northern regions would be waiting, whether he expected her or not. Lyra had served as a courier for 3 years, had delivered supplies to pack houses and territorial leaders throughout the region. She thought she understood what power looked like, what authority felt like when it filled a room and demanded acknowledgement. She was about to discover how wrong she'd been. The door opened at her touch, revealing a space that defied every assumption she'd held about royal chambers and seats of power. What she found inside would steal her breath, loosen her tongue, and set in motion events that neither she nor the Alpha King could have anticipated. Sometimes the most dangerous words are the truest ones, spoken without thought in moments when honesty becomes more powerful than wisdom. Sometimes a single sentence, uttered in awe rather than calculation, can crack the foundations of an Alpha King's carefully controlled world and let in light where there had been only shadow. Lyra Voss was about to learn exactly how much damage one moment of unguarded honesty could do, and how much beauty could grow from the wreckage. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The war chamber was nothing like what Lyra had expected. She'd prepared herself for intimidation. Dark stone, heavy furniture, the oppressive atmosphere of masculine authority designed to make visitors feel small and unwelcome. What she found instead was a space that took her breath away with its unexpected magnificence. The chamber stretched impossibly high, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move with their own purpose. Ancient pillars carved from single pieces of black marble supported archways that framed windows overlooking the entire northern valley. Maps covered every wall, not the simple territorial charts she'd seen elsewhere, but works of art that showed trade routes, migration patterns, and political alliances in detail that spoke of strategic brilliance. But it was the central feature that truly stunned her, a circular table carved from what appeared to be a single piece of obsidian, its surface polished to mirror brightness and inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and glow in the chamber's dim lighting. Around it, chairs that looked more like thrones held the weight of centuries, each one positioned with mathematical precision. The scale of it, the power inherent in every carefully planned detail, the presence that filled the space even when empty, it was overwhelming in ways that bypassed her rational mind and struck something deeper. "It's bigger than I thought," she whispered, the words emerging without conscious permission as she stared up at architecture that seemed to reach toward infinity. The silence that followed her unguarded observation was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat thundering against her ribs. Because she wasn't alone in the chamber, and the man who'd been standing with his back to her, studying something on the far wall, had gone absolutely still at her words. Alpha King Dane. Hollowcrest turned with fluid grace that should have been impossible in someone of his size, and Lyra felt the world tilt around her as she found herself face to face with legends made flesh. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of predators built for both speed and devastating strength. His dark hair was longer than current fashion dictated, pulled back in a style that revealed sharp cheekbones and a jaw that looked carved from granite. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, deep brown shot through with gold, ancient and knowing, holding depths that seemed to catalog every detail of her presence. "I beg your pardon?" His voice was lower than she'd expected, rough with an accent she couldn't place, and it carried the kind of authority that could compel obedience from other alphas. Heat flooded Lyra's cheeks as she realized exactly what she'd said, and to whom. In the sudden clarity that came with absolute mortification, she understood how her innocent observation about the chamber's size could be interpreted very differently by someone who didn't know her intent. "The room," she stammered, clutching her supply pack like armor. "I meant the room is bigger than I thought. The chamber not. I wasn't—" She gestured helplessly at the soaring architecture. "The scale of it is just overwhelming." Alpha King Dane studied her with the intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle, his golden gaze seeming to strip away every defense she'd thought she possessed. When he stepped closer, Lyra discovered what it meant to be the focus of an apex predator's attention. Every instinct screamed at her to run, while every nerve ending sparked with awareness she didn't want to examine. "Say it again," he said quietly, the command spoken soft enough to seem like a request, but carrying weight that made her body respond before her mind could object. "Say what again?" Though she suspected she knew exactly what he meant. "What you said when you walked in." He was close enough now that she could smell winter storms and something darker, more primal, that seemed to be part of his natural scent. "Your first impression of my chamber." The way he said chamber made it clear he was giving her an opportunity to clarify her meaning, to ensure there was no misunderstanding about what she'd been referring to. It should have been embarrassing, should have made her stumble over explanations and apologies. Instead, Lyra found herself meeting his gaze directly, seeing something in those brown gold eyes that looked like curiosity rather than offense. "It's bigger than I thought," she repeated, her voice steady despite the way her pulse was racing. "The architecture, the scale, the way it all comes together. I've delivered supplies to pack houses throughout the region, and I've never seen anything like this." Something shifted in the Alpha King's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he hadn't expected to find. "You weren't making a jest." "No." Lyra felt some of her nervousness ease as she realized he was actually listening, rather than simply waiting for her to finish, so he could respond appropriately to an insult. "I was genuinely impressed. This chamber, this entire fortress, it's like something out of legend. The craftsmanship alone must have taken decades. Longer than that." Dane stepped back slightly, though his attention remained fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. "The original construction began over 2 centuries ago. Each generation has added their own improvements, their own touches. The obsidian table," Lyra said, drawn despite herself toward the chamber's centerpiece. "Is it really carved from a single piece?" "It is. Quarried from the volcanic fields in the Eastern Territories and shaped by stone singers who possessed abilities that have been lost for over a century." Lyra moved closer to examine the table's surface, marveling at the way light seemed to move through the black stone like trapped starfire. The inscribed symbols were more complex up close, forming patterns that seemed to tell stories she couldn't quite decipher. "The symbols," she said, running her fingers just above the carved surface without quite touching. "They're not just decorative, are they? They mean something. Battle strategies, territorial agreements, bloodline records." Dane's voice held a note of something that might have been approval. "Most visitors see only an impressive piece of furniture. You see the history embedded in it, because you can read the history if you know how to look." Lyra glanced up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't interpret. "Everything here tells a story about the people who built it, the decisions they made, the things they valued enough to preserve in stone and metal and wood. And what story does this chamber tell you? The question should have been rhetorical, polite conversation to fill the awkward silence. But something in his tone suggested he genuinely wanted to know her assessment, as if her opinion mattered more than simple courtesy would require. Power, she said slowly, studying the way light fell through the high windows and pooled on strategic points throughout the room. But not just the kind that comes from strength or fear. This is the power that comes from knowledge, from understanding how all the pieces fit together. She gestured toward the wall maps with their intricate detail. Someone built this chamber to be a place where real decisions could be made, where complexity could be managed, and long-term strategies could be developed. You see all that from architecture? I see it from intention. Lyra realized she was speaking more freely than she'd ever spoken to anyone in authority, much less an alpha king whose reputation included personally killing 7 challengers to his throne. Every choice made in designing this space serves a purpose. The height creates psychological impact while also providing acoustic advantages. The central table forces collaborative seating arrangements rather than hierarchical ones. Even the window placement is designed to provide natural lighting during the hours when important meetings would typically be held. Dane was quiet for a long moment, his attention seeming to catalog every detail of her analysis. When he spoke, his words carried weight that made her pulse quicken. Most people who enter this chamber see only what they expect to see: displays of wealth, demonstrations of power, evidence of their own relative insignificance. His brown gold eyes met hers directly. You see functionality within beauty, strategy within design. That suggests a mind capable of understanding how power actually works, rather than just being impressed by its manifestations. The observation felt like both compliment and challenge, acknowledgement of intelligence paired with the kind of assessment that could prove dangerous if her answers disappointed him. I understand structural engineering, Lyra said carefully. Buildings tell you about the people who commissioned them, the problems they were trying to solve, the image they wanted to project. This chamber tells me you value effective decision-making more than impressive decoration. And that tells you what about me personally? The question was definitely not rhetorical, and Lyra had the uncomfortable sensation of walking through a minefield where the wrong answer could have consequences she couldn't predict. It tells me you're someone who thinks several moves ahead, she said finally. Someone who understands that real power comes from making better decisions than your opponents, not just from being stronger than they are. Interesting assessment from someone who's never met me before today. Is it wrong? No. His smile was slight, but genuine. It's remarkably accurate, which raises questions about how a supply courier developed such sophisticated analytical skills. Heat rose in Lyra's cheeks as she realized how much she'd revealed about herself through her observations. In her fascination with the chamber's design, she'd forgotten to maintain the careful anonymity that had kept her safe in previous encounters with territorial leadership. I read a lot, she said lamely. Architecture, engineering, military history. It's a hobby. A hobby that's given you insights most of my senior advisors lack. Dane moved to one of the wall maps, his finger tracing trade routes with casual familiarity. Tell me, what do you see when you look at these territorial boundaries? Lyra hesitated, understanding that she was being tested, but not certain what kind of answers would pass or fail the examination. Instability, she said finally. The eastern borders are too extended to defend effectively, and the southern territories show resource distribution patterns that suggest internal conflicts waiting to happen. Elaborate. The supply lines are overextended here. She pointed to a region marked with complex symbols. If someone wanted to destabilize your eastern alliances, they could do it by disrupting those trade routes at 3 specific choke points. And here, she indicated the southern regions, population density doesn't match agricultural capacity. They're either dependent on imports that could be interrupted, or they're facing resource shortages that could trigger territorial disputes. And how would you address those vulnerabilities? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Lyra was only beginning to understand. This wasn't casual conversation or polite interest in her opinions. The Alpha King was genuinely soliciting strategic analysis from someone he'd met minutes ago. I'm a supply courier, she said carefully. I'm not qualified to advise on territorial strategy. Your qualifications are irrelevant if your insights are accurate. Dane turned from the map to face her directly. I asked what you would do, not what your credentials suggest you should be allowed to do. The distinction sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with being treated as someone whose thoughts mattered, regardless of her official position. "Diversify the eastern supply routes," she said, stepping closer to the map despite the way proximity to the Alpha King made her pulse race. "Create redundancy so that disruption of any single trade path doesn't compromise the entire network, and establish grain reserves in the southern territories, either through increased agricultural investment or strategic stockpiling of imports. Both solutions require significant resource allocation, less than the cost of territorial wars if the vulnerabilities are exploited." Lyra found herself warming to the strategic discussion, despite the surreal nature of having it with one of the most powerful men in the northern regions. Prevention is almost always more cost-effective than reaction. Almost always? Sometimes you inherit situations where reaction is the only option left. But when you have the luxury of forward planning, she gestured toward the maps that showed careful documentation of resource flows and alliance structures. "Everything here suggests you prefer prevention to crisis management." "I do." Diane's attention was focused on her, with an intensity that should have been unnerving, but somehow wasn't. Which brings us to an interesting question, which is, what am I supposed to do with a supply courier who demonstrates strategic thinking superior to most of my official advisors? The question hit like cold water, washing away the pleasant intellectual engagement and replacing it with awareness of exactly how precarious her position had become. She'd forgotten, in the fascination of discussing complex problems with someone who actually understood them, that showing too much intelligence could be dangerous for someone in her position. "I should go," she said quickly, remembering the supply pack she'd abandoned near the chamber entrance. "I've delivered what I came to deliver, and I'm sure you have more important matters to attend to." "Do I?" Dane stepped between her and the door, not blocking her exit, but making it clear that leaving would require his permission. What could be more important than discovering unexpected intelligence in unexpected places? "Your actual advisors, who have actual qualifications and actual authority to provide counsel on matters of territorial security. My actual advisors, who haven't provided insights this useful in months." His smile was sharp with something that might have been anticipation. "Tell me, Lyra Voss, do you enjoy courier work?" The fact that he knew her name sent ice through her veins. She'd introduced herself to the guards at the outer gates, but for the Alpha King to have retained that information suggested her visit was being treated as more significant than a routine supply delivery. "It pays adequately and allows me to travel," she said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'm considering whether there might be better uses for your particular combination of observational skills and analytical thinking. I'm not qualified for advisory positions. Qualification is often less important than capability." Diane moved closer, close enough that she could see flecks of amber in his brown eyes. "And capability, it appears, is something you possess in abundance." Before Lyra could respond to what sounded suspiciously like a job offer, a knock at the chamber door interrupted their conversation. "Enter," Dane called, his tone shifting instantly from personal to professional. A man entered who radiated the same predatory authority as the Alpha King himself. Tall, dark-haired, with pale eyes that seemed to assess everything as potential threat or advantage. His attention flicked briefly to Lyra, before focusing entirely on Dane. "Your Majesty," he said with a slight bow that spoke of respect rather than submission. "The council is assembled and waiting for your presence." "Thank you, Marcus. I'll be along shortly." Dane's dismissal was polite but final, and the man withdrew with the silent efficiency of someone accustomed to royal preferences. "I really should go," Lyra said, understanding that she'd already occupied far more of the Alpha King's attention than anyone in her position should expect. "Yes," Dane agreed, "but not far." "What does that mean?" "It means I want you to remain in the stronghold tonight. Guest quarters will be prepared for you." His brown gold eyes held depth she couldn't fathom. "We're not finished with our conversation. Your Majesty, I appreciate the offer, but I have other deliveries to make, routes to complete. Will be handled by other couriers." The quiet authority in his voice made it clear this wasn't a request. "You'll remain here tonight, and tomorrow we'll discuss opportunities that might make better use of your talents than carrying supply packs through mountain passes." The implications of what he was suggesting sent both excitement and terror through her system. To be offered a position of actual responsibility, to have her analytical abilities valued rather than hidden, to work on problems that mattered rather than simply delivering other people's solutions. It was everything she'd never dared to hope for. It was also potentially the most dangerous situation she'd ever found herself in. "What if I prefer courier work?" she asked quietly. "Then you're free to return to it." Dane's smile was slight, but genuine. "But first, humor my curiosity about what other insights you might provide when given the opportunity to examine problems more complex than supply route optimization." As Lyra found herself escorted to guest quarters more luxurious than any accommodation she'd ever experienced, she couldn't shake the feeling that her simple comment about the chamber's size had set in motion events that would reshape her entire future. She'd come to deliver medical supplies and leave unnoticed. Instead, she'd somehow caught the attention of an Alpha King, who seemed to value intelligence over protocol and capability over credentials. Whether that proved to be the best or worst thing that had ever happened to her remained to be seen. The guest quarters assigned to Lyra were more luxurious than any space she'd ever occupied. A sitting room with furniture that looked handcrafted by masters, a bedroom with a bed large enough for 4 people, and a private bath equipped with amenities that spoke of serious wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the valley that stretched toward the horizon, and a fireplace large enough to roast a deer provided warmth against the mountain cold. It was beautiful, comfortable, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Lyra stood at the window watching the sun set behind distant peaks, trying to process the events of the afternoon. 3 hours ago, she'd been a supply courier whose biggest concern was navigating unfamiliar corridors without getting lost. Now she was apparently an overnight guest of the Alpha King himself, with promises of conversations about opportunities that could change her entire life. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Enter," she called, expecting a servant with dinner, or perhaps additional amenities for her stay. Instead, a woman entered, who moved with the predatory grace that marked all the wolves Lyra had encountered in the stronghold. She was perhaps 30 years old, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in an elaborate style, and dark eyes that missed nothing. Her clothes were elegant but practical, and she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ms. Voss," the woman said with a slight smile. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Blackthorne, the Alpha King's chief advisor. I hope you found the accommodation satisfactory." "Very satisfactory, thank you." Lyra studied the woman's expression, looking for clues about why the chief advisor would personally visit an overnight guest. Though I have to admit, they're rather more elaborate than I expected. His Majesty believes in treating guests well. Dr. Blackthorne moved to the sitting area, settling into one of the leather armchairs with fluid grace, particularly guests who've provided such interesting conversation. The emphasis on interesting made it clear that news of Lyra's extended discussion with the Alpha King had already spread through whatever communication networks existed among senior staff, which meant her presence here was being treated as potentially significant rather than merely coincidental. "I wouldn't call it conversation so much as me talking too much and him being polite enough to listen," Lyra replied, taking the chair across from Dr. Blackthorne. "Modesty is admirable, but inaccuracy serves no one." The advisor's smile was sharp with something that might have been amusement. "His Majesty doesn't engage in extended strategic discussions with random courier personnel out of politeness. If he spent an hour analyzing territorial vulnerabilities with you, it's because he found your insights valuable." "An hour?" Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks. It couldn't have been that long. It was precisely 73 minutes, during which time he kept a council of senior advisors waiting while he discussed trade route security and resource allocation with someone he'd met for the first time that afternoon. Dr. Blackthorne's dark eyes held depths that suggested she was evaluating Lyra for purposes not yet revealed. That represents either an unprecedented breach of protocol or recognition of exceptional capability. Which do you think it was? The question was clearly rhetorical, but it forced Lyra to confront the implications of what had happened. Alpha Kings didn't rearrange their schedules to accommodate fascinating strangers, particularly not strangers whose presence in the stronghold was entirely accidental. "I think it was probably both," she said honestly. "A breach of protocol motivated by, I'm not sure what. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of something rare enough to warrant investigation." No? Blackthorne leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. "Tell me, Ms. Voss, what are your long-term career objectives?" I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. Lyra felt as if she were being interviewed for a position she hadn't applied for. I suppose I've been focused more on immediate survival than long-term planning. Survival of what kind? The economic kind. Career work pays well enough to support modest living, and it doesn't require credentials I don't possess. But you do possess credentials, don't you? Educational background, analytical training, skills that extend far beyond package delivery. The accuracy of Dr. Blackthorn's assessment sent ice through Lyra's system. How do you know that? Because anyone capable of the strategic analysis you provided this afternoon has received formal training in systems thinking, probably at the university level. The advisor's smile was knowing and not entirely reassuring. The question is why someone with your apparent qualifications is working in a position that doesn't utilize them. Lyra was quiet for a moment, understanding that she was being asked to reveal information that could prove dangerous depending on how it was used. But the alternative, lying to someone who clearly already knew more than she was comfortable with, seemed even riskier. I have a degree in strategic studies from the University of Portland, she said finally, with concentrations in resource management and conflict analysis. Impressive credentials. And you're working as a courier because having a degree doesn't automatically translate to having opportunities to use it. The old frustration leaked into her voice despite her efforts to remain neutral, particularly when you don't have family connections or political influence to open doors that remain closed to merit alone. Ah, Dr. Blackthorn's expression showed understanding rather than surprise. You discovered that intelligence without influence is often considered a liability rather than an asset. Something like that. And how did that discovery affect your career planning? It convinced me that flying under the radar was safer than trying to prove I belonged in rooms where my presence wasn't wanted. Lyra met the advisor's gaze directly, at least until this afternoon, when I apparently forgot that lesson entirely. Perhaps you didn't forget it. Perhaps you simply encountered someone who values capability regardless of where it originates. Doctor. Blackthorn rose from her chair, moving to the window to study the darkening landscape. His Majesty has what some might consider unconventional approaches to identifying and utilizing talent. What kinds of unconventional approaches? The kind that prioritize results over protocol, insight over credentials, potential over pedigree. The advisor turned back to face Lyra. The kind that occasionally lead him to offer opportunities to people who wouldn't traditionally be considered qualified for them. The implication was clear, and it sent both excitement and terror through Lyra's system. Are you suggesting he's considering offering me a position? I'm suggesting he's considering whether your analytical capabilities might be better utilized in service to territorial security than in delivering medical supplies. Dr. Blackthorn's expression grew more serious. But such positions come with responsibilities and risks that courier work doesn't involve. What kinds of risks? The kind that come with access to sensitive information, proximity to political decision-making, and visibility to anyone who might view your influence as a threat to their own. The advisor's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing weather rather than potentially life-threatening complications. Intelligence is valuable, Ms. Voss, but it can also be dangerous to possess. Are you trying to discourage me from accepting whatever offer he might make? I'm ensuring you understand what acceptance would entail. Dr. Blackthorn moved back to her chair, settling with the same fluid grace she'd shown earlier. His Majesty values honesty above almost everything else. If you're going to work with him, you need to understand the full scope of what that means. Before Lyra could ask what she meant by that cryptic statement, another knock interrupted their conversation. "Enter," Dr. Blackthorn called. A servant appeared carrying a tray laden with what was clearly dinner for two, elaborate dishes that smelled incredible and looked like artwork. "Compliments of His Majesty," the young man said, setting the tray on the low table between the chairs. "He thought you might enjoy discussing matters over a proper meal." As the servant departed, Lyra stared at the food with growing understanding of just how much attention the Alpha King was paying to her comfort. This wasn't standard guest treatment. This was personal consideration from someone whose time and attention were among the most valuable commodities in the territory. "He's not just being polite, is he?" she asked Dr. Blackthorn, who was examining the dinner selection with obvious approval. His Majesty is many things, but wasteful of his own time isn't one of them. The advisor selected a portion of what appeared to be roasted fowl with herb crust. "If he's investing this level of personal attention in your visit, it's because he's seriously considering how your capabilities might serve territorial interests. And you're here to evaluate whether I'm worth that investment. I'm here to ensure you understand what you're considering becoming involved in." Dr. Blackthorn's expression grew more serious as she set down her fork. Ms. Voss, may I speak plainly? Please do. The Alpha King's inner circle is small, carefully selected, and absolutely loyal. It has to be, because the decisions we're involved in making affect thousands of lives and shape the future of multiple territories. The advisor's dark eyes held depths that spoke of experience with exactly the kinds of complications she was describing. If you accept a position of responsibility here, you'll be expected to maintain that same level of commitment and discretion. I understand. Do you? Because understanding intellectually is different from understanding emotionally what it means to have people's lives depend on your judgment. Dr. Blackthorn leaned forward, her intensity unmistakable. It means sleepless nights worrying about consequences of decisions you helped make. It means accepting that sometimes there are no good choices, only choices that minimize harm. It means living with the knowledge that failure on your part could result in deaths you might have prevented. The weight of what the advisor was describing settled over Lyra like a heavy blanket. She'd been focused on the intellectual challenge of strategic analysis, the appeal of finally using her education for something meaningful. But Dr. Blackthorn was forcing her to confront the human cost of the decisions that would follow from that analysis. Have you ever had to live with consequences like that? Lyra asked quietly. Yes, and so has His Majesty, which is why he's careful about who he allows into positions of real influence. The advisor's expression softened slightly, but it's also why he values people who can see problems clearly and think about solutions creatively. The intellectual capabilities you demonstrated this afternoon are exactly what territorial security requires. And if I'm not strong enough to handle the emotional weight of those responsibilities, then you'll discover that before accepting any permanent position. His Majesty doesn't thrust people into roles they can't manage. He evaluates them carefully first. Dr. Blackthorn's smile was reassuring, which is why tomorrow's conversation will be as much about your psychological resilience as about your analytical skills. As they finished dinner and Dr. Blackthorn prepared to leave, Lyra found herself with one final question that had been nagging at her since the afternoon's unexpected encounter. Why me? She asked. I mean, specifically, why is he considering me for anything beyond thanking me politely for the supply delivery and sending me on my way? Dr. Blackthorn paused at the door, her expression thoughtful. Because in 37 years of life, including 15 years in positions of leadership, His Majesty has rarely encountered someone who could analyze complex problems as clearly as you did this afternoon, while also maintaining the courage to speak honestly about what they observed. Courage? Most people who enter the Alpha King's presence tell him what they think he wants to hear. You told him what you actually thought, without apparent concern for whether it would please or offend him. The advisor's smile was genuine. That combination of intelligence and honesty is extraordinarily rare, Ms. Voss. Rare enough to be worth significant investment in its development. After Dr. Blackthorn departed, Lyra found herself alone with thoughts that seemed to spiral faster with each passing hour. She stood again at the window, watching stars emerge over the mountain landscape, and tried to imagine what her life would look like if she accepted whatever opportunity the Alpha King was preparing to offer. No more anonymous courier runs through familiar territories. No more careful invisibility designed to avoid attention from people who might find her intelligence threatening. Instead, visibility, responsibility, the chance to use her capabilities for something that actually mattered. The chance to work with someone who apparently valued her insights enough to rearrange his schedule to explore them further. But also the risks Dr. Blackthorn had described, the weight of decisions that affected lives, the target that would be painted on her back by anyone who viewed her influence as a threat to their own, the emotional burden of choices that sometimes involved accepting harm in order to prevent greater harm. As she prepared for sleep in a bed more comfortable than anything she'd ever experienced, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that her casual comment about the chamber's size had opened a door she might not be able to close. Tomorrow would bring the conversation that could reshape her entire future. The question was whether she was brave enough to walk through the doorway that the Alpha King was apparently prepared to offer, or whether the safety of her current anonymous existence was worth more than the opportunity to finally use her intelligence for something meaningful. Either way, she was about to discover exactly how much one unguarded moment of honesty could change the course of a life. Dawn arrived with a soft knock at Lyra's door, and the voice of a servant announcing that Alpha King Dane requested her presence for breakfast in his private dining chamber. Not a formal summons to his war room, not a meeting in the Great Hall surrounded by advisors and protocol. a personal invitation to share a meal in what was apparently his most private space. Lyra dressed carefully in the clean clothes that had mysteriously appeared overnight, wondering if the Alpha King's staff were mind readers or simply exceptionally good at anticipating guest needs. The garments were well made, but not ostentatious, appropriate for someone who might be transitioning from courier to something more significant, but wasn't quite sure what that something might be. The private dining chamber was smaller than the war room, but no less impressive in its way. Where the larger space spoke of power and strategic thinking, this room whispered of personal taste and quiet luxury. Books lined one wall from floor to ceiling, their spines showing titles in multiple languages. Art that looked both ancient and precious decorated the remaining walls, and windows faced east, filling the space with natural light that made everything seem to glow with warmth. Dane stood with his back to the door, silhouetted against the morning light, as he studied something beyond the windows. He'd traded yesterday's formal robes for simple dark clothing that somehow made him seem more approachable, while still radiating the controlled power that marked him as apex predator. "Good morning," he said without turning around, apparently having heard her enter despite her attempts at quiet movement. "I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you. The accommodations were far more comfortable than necessary." Lyra moved into the room cautiously, still uncertain about protocol when dining privately with someone whose authority was absolute. "Though I have to admit, I spent most of the night wondering what I was doing here. And what conclusions did you reach? That I'm either being offered an opportunity I never could have imagined, or I'm about to be politely but firmly told to return to courier work and forget yesterday's conversation ever happened." Dane turned to face her, and she was surprised to see what looked like amusement in his brown gold eyes. "Which outcome are you hoping for?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. "I'm not sure hoping is something I can afford to do in this situation." "Explain." "Because if I hope for the opportunity and it doesn't materialize, I'll be disappointed in ways that make returning to my previous life more difficult." Lyra accepted the chair he gestured toward, noting that breakfast had been laid out for two, with the same attention to detail she'd observed in yesterday's dinner. "And if I hope to return to anonymity and instead find myself thrust into responsibilities I'm not prepared for, I'll fail in ways that affect more than just my own career prospects." "So, you're choosing not to have preferences about your own future?" "I'm choosing to focus on being honest about my capabilities rather than trying to predict outcomes I can't control." Dane settled across from her, his attention seeming to catalog every detail of her response. "Dr. Blackthorne said you impressed her with your understanding of what working in my inner circle would entail. She impressed me with her honesty about the costs of such positions." Lyra accepted coffee from a pot that smelled better than anything she'd ever experienced. "I appreciate being told the truth about risks, rather than having them discovered through unpleasant experience. And having heard those truths, are you still interested in exploring possibilities? Are you still interested in offering them?" I asked first. The gentle challenge in his voice made her smile, despite the seriousness of their conversation. "Yes, I'm interested. Terrified but interested. Good. Fear without interest suggests poor judgment. Interest without fear suggests poor understanding of consequences." Dane's expression grew more serious as he began serving breakfast from dishes that looked as elaborate as anything she'd seen in formal restaurants. "Tell me about your educational background in more detail than you provided to Dr. Blackthorne." Over the next hour, as they shared a meal that was both more and less formal than she'd expected, Lyra found herself describing her academic work with someone who asked questions that demonstrated genuine understanding of strategic theory and practical application. Dane didn't just listen. He engaged, challenged assumptions, explored implications of analytical frameworks she'd thought were too specialized for general interest. "Your thesis project," he said as they finished eating, "the one on resource allocation in territorial conflicts. What were your primary conclusions?" "That most territorial disputes aren't really about the territories themselves, but about the resources they control or the strategic advantages they provide." Lyra found herself leaning forward, drawn into discussion of work that had consumed 2 years of intensive research, which means that resolving such conflicts often requires addressing underlying resource security, rather than just negotiating boundary lines. "And how does that apply to our current situation with the Eastern Territories?" The question should have surprised her. Yesterday she'd been a courier, and now the Alpha King was asking for her analysis of active territorial issues. Instead, it felt like a natural continuation of analytical work that had always fascinated her. The Eastern alliances aren't stable, because they're built on resource dependencies that create vulnerability rather than mutual benefit, she said, visualizing the map she'd studied yesterday. The primary alliance partners need your territory's mineral exports, but they're not providing equivalent value in return. That creates resentment on their side and leverage concerns on yours. Suggested solutions? Diversify the relationship structure. Instead of simple resource extraction agreements, develop joint ventures that give your partners investment stakes in production, rather than just purchasing rights. Lyra paused, suddenly aware that she was offering unsolicited advice on matters of territorial policy. Although I realize I'm speaking far outside my area of expertise. Your area of expertise is exactly what I'm trying to determine. Dane rose from the table, moving to one of the windows that overlooked the valley. The theoretical framework you're applying comes from formal education, but the practical insights suggest experience with implementation challenges. Where did that experience originate? Heat rose in Lyra's cheeks as she realized he was asking about the gap between her credentials and her current employment situation. Consulting work, mostly. Small projects for local businesses and regional organizations that needed strategic analysis, but couldn't afford established consulting firms. And you left that work to become a courier because consulting income is unpredictable, and courier work provided steady employment. She joined him at the window, studying the landscape that stretched toward distant mountains. Also because some consulting clients became uncomfortable with recommendations that challenged their preferred approaches. Uncomfortable how? The kind of uncomfortable that results in payment disputes, reputation attacks, and suggestions that perhaps analytical objectivity isn't as valuable as political accommodation. The old frustration leaked into her voice despite her efforts to remain neutral. I discovered that being right isn't always appreciated, when being right means admitting previous strategies were flawed. Dane was quiet for a moment, his attention seemingly focused on something beyond the valley. When he spoke, his words carried weight that made her pulse quicken. The position I'm considering offering you would eliminate both of those concerns. Income would be stable and substantial, and political accommodation would never be expected to override analytical accuracy. Lyra felt her heart skip a beat at the implied offer. What kind of position? Strategic advisor with focus on resource security and territorial stability. You'd work directly with me and Dr. Blackthorne on policy development, threat assessment, and long-term planning. He turned to face her, his brown gold eyes holding depths that seemed to strip away every defense she'd thought she possessed. The work would be challenging, the responsibilities significant, and the risks exactly what Dr. Blackthorne described. And the alternative is returning to courier work with a polite letter of recommendation? The alternative is returning to courier work with the knowledge that you're always welcome to reconsider if your circumstances change. His smile was slight, but genuine. I don't believe in pressuring people into positions they're not ready for, but I also don't believe in wasting opportunities when they present themselves. The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Everything Lyra had trained for, worked toward, hoped for despite herself, finally within reach, offered by someone whose authority was absolute, and whose judgment she was learning to trust. What would acceptance look like? She asked quietly. Initially, a probationary period during which we evaluate compatibility of working styles and effectiveness of collaboration. If that proves successful, a permanent appointment with salary, benefits, and living arrangements appropriate to the position. Living arrangements? Advisor-level quarters within the stronghold, private office space, access to resources necessary for effective policy analysis. Dane's attention never left her face, as if reading her response in expressions she didn't know she was making. The work requires proximity to decision-making processes and immediate access to sensitive information. The practical implications of what he was describing began to sink in. Not just a job, but a complete transformation of her life. From anonymous courier, moving through peripheral territories, to strategic advisor at the center of regional power. What if I fail? The question emerged from a part of herself that had learned to expect disappointment, to prepare for rejection, even when opportunity seemed within reach. Then we'll have discovered that intellectual capability doesn't always translate to practical effectiveness, and we'll both have learned something valuable about the limitations of academic preparation for real-world application. Dane's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing whether rather than potentially career-ending failure. But failure is only catastrophic if you're not allowed to learn from it. And if I succeed, then you'll discover what it feels like to use your intelligence for purposes that actually matter, to see your analytical work translated into policies that affect thousands of lives, to be part of something larger than individual survival. The vision he painted was seductive in ways that went beyond simple career advancement. To be valued for her mind rather than tolerated despite it. To work on problems that challenged her capabilities rather than merely required them. To be part of decisions that shaped the future rather than just responding to choices others had made. Dr. Blackthorne mentioned that honesty was particularly valued in your inner circle, Lyra said slowly. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that if you disagree with my decisions, you're expected to say so and explain your reasoning. It means that if you identify problems I haven't recognized, you're obligated to bring them to my attention, regardless of whether they might embarrass me or challenge my previous judgments. Dane moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his brown eyes. It means that your first loyalty must always be to accurate analysis rather than personal diplomacy, even if that creates conflict with other advisors. Especially then. Consensus built on avoiding difficult truth serves no one. His voice dropped, becoming more personal despite the professional nature of their discussion. The reason I'm offering you this position, Lyra, is because yesterday you demonstrated the courage to speak honestly about what you observed without concern for whether it would please me. That kind of intellectual courage is extraordinarily rare, and extraordinarily dangerous in someone without established credibility, which is why the probationary period exists, to establish credibility through demonstrated results rather than inherited reputation. Dane's smile was sharp with anticipation. Are you willing to take that risk? Lyra looked out the window at the valley that stretched toward horizons she'd never explored, then back at the man who was offering her the chance to help shape the future of territories that affected thousands of lives. A week ago, her biggest decision had been which delivery route to take to minimize travel time. Now she was being asked to step into a role that could determine whether conflicts escalated or were resolved peacefully. What happens if I say yes, and then discover I've made a terrible mistake? Then you'll have the same option you have now, to walk away and return to the life you were living before yesterday. Dane's expression grew more serious. The only thing that changes permanently is your understanding of what you're capable of when given the opportunity to try. The weight of decision settled over her like destiny recognizing its moment. She could choose safety, anonymity, the predictable challenges of courier work, and the certainty that came with low expectations. Or she could choose risk, visibility, the chance to discover whether her intelligence was strong enough to bear the weight of real responsibility. I have one condition, she said finally, which is, if I accept this position, I want it to be because you believe I can do the work effectively, not because you're curious about whether I might be able to. Lyra met his gaze directly, seeing her own determination reflected in brown gold eyes that held depth she was only beginning to explore. I don't want to be an interesting experiment. I want to be a valuable addition to your team. Fair enough. Dane extended his hand, the gesture formal, but loaded with implications that went far beyond simple professional agreement. Do we have an understanding, Strategic Advisor Voss? The title sent a thrill through her that had everything to do with recognition and nothing to do with safety. As she clasped his hand, feeling strength that could crush stone but was controlled with infinite care, Lyra realized that her unguarded comment about the chamber's size had indeed opened a door she couldn't close. But instead of regretting the exposure that had led to this moment, she found herself grateful for the accident of honesty that had brought her to someone who valued truth more than comfort, capability more than credentials, potential more than pedigree. We do, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was committing to. When do I start? Now. Dane's smile was brilliant and transformative, revealing depths of satisfaction that spoke of hopes he hadn't dared acknowledge even to himself. Dr. Blackthorne is waiting in the war room with briefing materials on 3 developing situations that require immediate analytical attention. Immediately? Welcome to strategic advisory work, Lyra. The problems never wait for convenient timing, and the decisions can't be postponed until you feel fully prepared. His expression grew more serious, though humor still lurked in his eyes. Are you ready to discover whether academic preparation translates to practical effectiveness? As they walked together toward the war room where her new career would begin, Lyra reflected on the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. A casual observation about architectural scale, spoken without thought or calculation, had somehow convinced an Alpha King that she possessed the rare combination of intelligence and honesty that territorial leadership required. "One more question," she said as they reached the familiar massive doors. "Why did you ask me to repeat what I'd said when I first walked into your chamber? What were you listening for?" Dane paused with his hand on the door handle, turning to study her face with the intensity that seemed to be his natural expression when considering important questions. "I was listening for whether your words came from mockery or awe," he said quietly. "Whether you were making a jest at my expense, or genuinely impressed by what you'd encountered. And when you repeated the words with the same wonder in your voice, when you explained what you'd actually meant without embarrassment or defensiveness, I realized I was talking to someone who spoke truth instinctively rather than strategically." His smile was slight, but genuine. "That's when I knew I wanted to keep listening." As the doors opened to reveal Dr. Blackthorne waiting with maps, documents, and what appeared to be several extremely complex problems requiring immediate attention, Lyra understood that she was about to discover exactly what it meant to put her analytical capabilities to work on issues that actually mattered. The war room was still bigger than she'd thought when she first encountered it yesterday. But now, instead of overwhelming her with its scale and power, it felt like a workspace where her mind could finally stretch to its full potential. Some accidents, she was learning, were actually destiny recognizing its moment and arranging for the right words to be spoken at precisely the right time. Her career as strategic advisor Voss was about to begin, born from a moment of unguarded honesty that had somehow convinced an Alpha King to take a chance on intelligence over influence, capability over credentials. Whether she would prove worthy of that faith remained to be seen. But as she took her place at the obsidian table where decisions that shaped the future were made, Lyra knew that she would never again have to hide her intelligence or apologize for seeing problems clearly and speaking about solutions honestly. It was, she thought as Dr. Blackthorne began outlining the first crisis requiring her analytical attention, exactly what she'd been training for her entire life without knowing it. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.